Welcome back to Dark Domain, the only place where sleepless nights are guaranteed. Tonight we've got 3 disturbing stories that'll have you second-guessing every shadow in your house, and maybe even your GPS settings. But before you curl up with paranoia, here's your mission. Drop a comment telling me the pettiest way you'd haunt someone if you were a ghost. I mean, we're talking about switching their coffee to decaf or making their favorite show buffer at 99%. Get creative, because after tonight's stories, you'll want to keep things light. And hey, don't be that person who gets haunted by YouTube's algorithms. Smash that subscribe button like you're trying to win a staring contest with a possessed doll. Thumbs up if you're brave enough for the stories. Let's get into it. Echoes of Mercy. I never thought a job in nursing would lead me to question everything I believed about life and death. My name is Mark Doyle, and I work as an orderly at St. Augustine Care Home, an old, crumbling facility for the elderly in New Orleans. The place isn't much, a bit run down with cracked walls and that damp, musty smell that clings to everything. Most of the patients have been here for years, either forgotten by their families or waiting for time to catch up with them. I've seen a lot of strange things in my few years here. When you're surrounded by people who have one foot in the grave, you get used to the odd things they say or do. The mind plays tricks on you when you're that close to the end. At least that's what I always thought. But what happened last week has me questioning everything. It started with Mr. Chasson, one of the residents on the 2nd floor. He was 85, suffering from dementia, and had been bedridden for the better part of a year. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was gibberish. Fragments of memories, confusion, all jumbled up. I'd seen the decline happen slowly, week by week, until he was little more than a shadow of the man he used to be. Then, out of nowhere, things changed. I was making my rounds one night, checking on the residents before my shift ended. When I reached Mr. Chasson's room, I heard something strange. At first, I thought it was the TV, but as I got closer, I realized it was his voice. He was talking. Not the usual incoherent rambling, but a full conversation. I stood outside the door, listening. His voice was strong, clear, like he hadn't been bedridden for months. He was speaking to someone, but as I opened the door, I saw he was alone. "Mr. Chasson?" I asked, stepping into the room. He turned his head toward me, and for the first time in months, he looked present. His eyes weren't clouded with confusion. They were sharp, focused. "You can hear them, can't you?" he said, his voice low but steady. "Hear who?" I asked, my heart picking up speed. He smiled, a cold, distant smile. "The ones in the walls. They're coming." The next day, I mentioned it to Dr. Emery, the head of the facility. He brushed it off, said it was just a moment of clarity, something that happens with dementia patients from time to time. "They get these bursts of lucidity right before the end," he said. "Don't think too much of it." But I couldn't shake it. The way Mr. Chasson had spoken, the certainty in his voice, it wasn't just some random burst of memory. He was sure of what he was saying. That night, as I was leaving the building, I passed by the 2nd floor hallway and heard it again. The sound of voices. This time they weren't coming from Mr. Chasson's room. They were coming from the walls. I stopped, my hand on the doorframe, and listened. It was faint but unmistakable. Whispers, dozens of them, all speaking at once. The words were too quiet to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. Fear. Pain. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes before the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Heavy, suffocating, like the building itself was holding its breath. The next few nights, things escalated. More residents began reporting strange occurrences, hearing footsteps in the halls when no one was there, feeling cold hands touch their skin in the middle of the night. Some said they saw figures, shadows that moved through the walls and disappeared before they could scream for help. The other orderlies and nurses were on edge, whispering about ghosts and hauntings, but no one wanted to admit something was wrong. And then Mr. Chasson died. It happened during the night, quietly, without warning. He had been fine, or as fine as someone in his condition could be, just hours before. When we found him in the morning, there was no sign of struggle, no apparent cause of death. He just stopped. But there was something odd about the way his body looked. His face. He had this expression, one I'd seen before on other patients. It wasn't peace. It was terror, frozen in place like he'd seen something in his final moments that none of us could understand. That same day, 2 other residents passed, both of them with that same look on their faces. After that, the whispers got louder. Every night as I made my rounds, I could hear them. Those voices growing stronger. It wasn't just the walls anymore. They were coming from the vents, the floors, the ceiling. It was like the entire building was alive with them, a constant murmur just beneath the surface. And the shadows, those dark, shifting shapes that appeared at the edge of my vision, became more frequent. I'd see them in the corners of the residents' rooms, standing silently by their beds, or sometimes just drifting through the halls. No one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they did, but were too scared to admit it. I started staying late after my shift, trying to figure out what was happening. I searched through old records, looking for anything that might explain the strange events. That's when I found it. St. Augustine Care Home wasn't always a nursing facility. Decades ago, it had been something else. A hospital, but not the kind you think of. It was a place where they sent people to be forgotten, a place for those society didn't want to deal with anymore. The records were vague, but I found references to experimental treatments, things that weren't exactly ethical. Electroshock therapy, lobotomies, isolation. The patients who were brought here weren't meant to leave. According to the files, many of them didn't. I confronted Dr. Emery the next day, asked him if he knew about the building's history. At first, he denied it, said it was all in the past, nothing to worry about. But the way he avoided my eyes told me he knew more than he was letting on. "They're still here, aren't they?" I said, my voice shaking. "The people who died in this place, they're still trapped here." He didn't answer. He just looked at me, his face pale, and said, "You should let it go, Mark. Some things are better left buried." I couldn't let it go. That night, I went back to the second-floor hallway, the place where I'd first heard the whispers. I stood there in the dark, waiting, listening. At first, it was quiet. Then, slowly, the voices returned. Louder this time, clearer. I could hear them crying out, begging for release, for someone to acknowledge their pain. They weren't just voices. They were people. People who had suffered, who had been forgotten. And then I saw them. Figures, pale and translucent, moving through the walls, their faces twisted in agony. They reached out for me, their hands brushing against my skin, cold and desperate. I ran. I don't work at St. Augustine anymore. After that night, I couldn't stay. The whispers, the shadows, the things I saw. It was too much. I don't know what's still trapped in that building, but I know it's not at peace. There are echoes of the past in that place, echoes of suffering and torment that have never faded. The people who died there, who were mistreated and forgotten, are still there, still waiting for someone to acknowledge them. But no one wants to listen. The Marionette's curse. I never believed in curses. That kind of superstition seemed out of place in the modern world, like something out of an old folk tale. But all of that changed when I inherited my grandmother's house. It wasn't the house itself that bothered me. It was old, sure, and full of creaking floors and drafty windows, but it was more or less what I expected. My grandmother had lived there alone for the last decade of her life, a solitary figure after my grandfather's passing. When she passed away, the house came to me, along with everything inside it. The first time I saw the Marionette, it was tucked away in an old wooden chest in the attic, wrapped in a yellowed cloth. I wasn't looking for it. I'd just been cleaning out the attic, deciding what to keep and what to throw away. But as soon as I pulled back the cloth, I felt an immediate chill run down my spine. The Marionette was an antique, beautifully crafted. Its wooden face was smooth and intricately painted, with wide glass eyes that seemed to sparkle in the dim attic light. Its arms and legs hung limply, attached to strings that led to a small wooden cross used to manipulate it. But there was something about it that unnerved me. The eyes, though expertly made, seemed too lifelike, too aware. I'd heard stories about my grandmother's obsession with puppetry when she was younger, but I never thought much of it. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that washed over me as I held the marionette in my hands. I almost put it back in the chest, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to bring it downstairs, thinking it would make an interesting piece for the living room. That was my first mistake. From the moment I placed the marionette on the mantelpiece, things began to change in the house. Small things at first. The lights would flicker for no reason. Doors that I knew I had closed would be open when I returned to the room. I would hear soft, almost imperceptible tapping sounds coming from the walls late at night, like someone gently knocking. Then, the dreams started. Every night for a week, I dreamed of the marionette. In the dream, I was sitting in the living room watching TV. But when I glanced over at the mantelpiece, the marionette wasn't hanging limp from its strings anymore. It was sitting upright, its head tilted slightly, its wide glass eyes fixed on me. It never moved, at least not when I was looking. But every time I blinked or turned my head, I could sense it shifting, like it was creeping closer, watching, waiting. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. But even in the daylight, the unease stayed with me. I began to avoid the living room, leaving the TV off and spending most of my time in the kitchen or upstairs in the bedroom. I thought about getting rid of the marionette, but something held me back. Maybe it was a sense of obligation to my grandmother, or maybe it was something more, something I didn't want to admit to myself. One evening, after a particularly long and restless day, I heard the sound of footsteps in the house. At first, I thought I was imagining it. After all, the house was old and prone to settling noises. But as the sound grew louder, I realized it wasn't coming from upstairs or outside. It was coming from the living room. My stomach twisted as I made my way toward the source of the noise. The hallway seemed longer than usual, the shadows on the walls stretching and distorting. The sound of footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached the living room door and slowly pushed it open. There, in the middle of the room, stood the marionette. It wasn't hanging from its strings anymore. It was standing on its own two wooden feet, its arms bent awkwardly at its sides. Its head was tilted up, those glass eyes now trained directly on me. I froze in the doorway, my mind reeling. It wasn't possible. It couldn't move on its own. And then, it smiled. The marionette's painted lips curled upward in a slow, unnatural grin. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The room felt cold, so cold I could see my breath fogging in the air. The marionette took a step forward, its wooden joints creaking as it moved. I turned and ran. My feet pounded on the wooden floor as I sprinted up the stairs, not daring to look back. I slammed the bedroom door behind me and locked it, my chest heaving with panic. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were slow, deliberate, growing louder as they climbed the stairs. The handle of the door rattled. I backed up against the wall, my heart pounding in my throat. The rattling grew more insistent, more frantic, until the door burst open with a loud crack. I screamed, but the room was empty. There was nothing there. Nothing but the icy chill that had followed me from downstairs. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner, too terrified to sleep, too afraid to close my eyes. I waited for the marionette to appear, for those cold glass eyes to find me again. But it never came. By morning, I knew I had to get rid of it. Whatever connection my grandmother had to the marionette, whatever curse it carried, I didn't want any part of it. I grabbed it from the living room, wrapped it in a sheet, and drove out to the old quarry just outside town. Without hesitation, I tossed the marionette into the deepest pit I could find and left, not daring to look back. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly that night. But as the days passed, something began to gnaw at me. I could still hear the tapping sometimes, faint but unmistakable. And when I passed by mirrors, I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, like a wooden figure standing just behind me watching. And then one night I woke up to the sound of footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. I sat up in bed, my heart racing as the door to my bedroom creaked open. And there it was, the Marionette. It smiled at me with those same glass eyes, and this time I knew. There was no escaping it. The passenger. I never should have picked him up. That's what I tell myself now, over and over, as I replay the moment in my mind. I was just trying to help, just trying to do the right thing. But I'll never forget the look on his face. It started like any other day. I was driving back from my sister's place, cutting through the barren stretch of highway that connected her small town to mine. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows over the empty road. That's when I saw him. A man on the side of the highway stumbling toward the road with his arm raised for a ride. I almost drove past him. I should have. But something about the desperation in his eyes made me slow down. His face was pale, his clothes disheveled, and he was holding his head with one hand, as if he was in pain. I pulled over, and before I could even ask him if he was okay, he yanked open the passenger door and collapsed into the seat, panting and wild-eyed. "Drive," he gasped. "Please, just drive." I hesitated for a moment, the rational part of me screaming to get him out of the car. But something about the way he said it, the panic in his voice, made me press the gas. The car sped forward, and I could feel the tension radiating off him as he clutched his head, breathing heavily. For the first few miles, neither of us spoke. I kept glancing over at him, waiting for an explanation, but he just stared straight ahead, his fingers digging into his scalp. His face was slick with sweat, his knuckles white. Finally, I couldn't take the silence anymore. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Do you need a hospital or something?" He shook his head violently, grimacing like the words themselves hurt him. "No hospital, no stopping. You have to keep driving." "Why?" I pressed. "What's going on?" He turned to me, his eyes wide with fear. "If we stop, I die." I opened my mouth to protest, to demand some sort of explanation, but he cut me off. "Look, I don't have time to explain. It's in my head. It's killing me. If I stop moving, if we slow down, it'll crush my brain." I stared at him, not knowing what to say. He sounded insane, but there was something in his eyes. Something raw, primal, that made me hesitate. His face was twisted in agony, and the way he clutched his head made me wonder if he was really in pain. "I was running," he muttered. "It started this morning. Pressure. Like my head was going to explode. I thought it was just a migraine, but it kept getting worse. Then it started. The only way to keep it at bay is to keep moving. The faster, the better." "What do you mean, it?" I asked, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. "What's in your head?" He shook his head again, wincing. "I don't know. It's a sound. It's like there's something inside me, screaming, pushing against my skull. I can't stop moving or it'll..." He broke off, doubling over in the seat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please, just keep driving." I should have pulled over. I should have called for help. But the fear in his voice, the sheer desperation, made me keep my foot on the gas. We drove for what felt like hours, the empty road stretching out endlessly in front of us. Every time I slowed down, even slightly, he'd cry out in pain, clutching his head harder and begging me to go faster. The speedometer crept higher and higher, and I found myself pushing the limits of what my car could handle. But then, the pressure in the air began to change. It wasn't just him anymore. I felt it too. It started as a low hum, barely noticeable, like the faint buzz of a far-off engine. But soon it grew louder, a constant, oppressive vibration that filled the car, pressing against my ears and making my skull throb. I glanced over at the man who was now writhing in his seat, his eyes squeezed shut, his teeth gritted in pain. "It's getting worse," he groaned. "We're not going fast enough." "What do you mean?" I shouted, the panic rising in my voice. "How fast do we need to go?" He didn't answer, just clenched his jaw and pointed forward, urging me to drive faster. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, the car shuddering as the speedometer climbed past 90, then 100. The hum in the air was deafening now, a physical force pressing down on us from all sides. My vision blurred as my head pounded, the pressure building inside my own skull, threatening to split it open. And then suddenly the man screamed. It was a horrible guttural sound, like he was being torn apart from the inside. His hands flew to his head, his fingers clawing at his scalp as if trying to rip something out. His eyes bulged, and blood began to trickle from his nose and ears. "We're not going to make it," he gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "It's too late." The car jolted and I swerved, nearly losing control. The man's body convulsed, his head snapping back as the pressure inside him reached its breaking point. With one final, sickening crack, his head collapsed inward, as if an invisible force had crushed his skull from the inside. I screamed, slamming on the brakes as the car skidded to a stop in the middle of the empty road. The hum in the air faded almost instantly, leaving only a ringing in my ears and the heavy thud of my own heartbeat. I sat there trembling, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. The man's body lay motionless beside me, his face unrecognizable, his head shattered. For what felt like an eternity, I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the blood-spattered windshield, the eerie silence pressing in on me from all sides. Then slowly the hum returned. This time it wasn't coming from him. It was coming from me. I felt the pressure building inside my head, the same relentless force pushing against my skull. My vision blurred, my ears rang, and I knew I had to move. I had to get away, to outrun whatever it was that had taken him. With shaking hands, I started the car, the engine roaring to life. And I drove. Well, that's enough spine-chilling stories for one night, don't you think? Now, if your lights start flickering or you hear footsteps in the hallway, don't blame me. Before you run off to triple-check the locks, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe. It won't stop the nightmares, but it helps the channel grow. And don't forget to drop a comment telling me the pettiest way you'd haunt someone if you were a ghost. Let's see what you can come up with. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.